Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to Nature Connects. Nature Connects is TNC in Massachusetts webinar series that connects you as scientists, experts, and influencers and our partners from New England and around the world. I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Deb Markowitz, the State Director of TNC in Massachusetts, and your host for today. Here at the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts, we're dedicated to creating a healthier world for all. We work both locally and globally using innovative science and scalable, long-lasting solutions to tackle the most complex environmental challenges facing our warming planet. We know that what we do here in Massachusetts to protect nature will mean a better future for people and the planet. We have an exciting program for you today. This is part 2 in our summer series on TNC's work in Alaska. Some of you may have tuned in last week to hear about our work in Bristol Bay, but if you missed it, we'll link to a recording in the chat. Together, today, we'll be learning about TNC's work in the Emerald Edge. The Emerald Edge, and I love that word, that term, right? It spans 100 million acres of temperate rainforest in the Pacific Northwest. We'll be hearing specifically about a new initiative called the Seacoast Trust. The Seacoast Trust is a coalition of tribes, Alaska Native corporations, and conservation and community development nonprofits. And these groups are working together to ensure Alaska Native communities of Southeast Alaska are empowered to achieve healthy and vibrant communities and economies, while also conserving nature for the benefit of current and future generations. So before we dive into today's program, I wanted to share a little bit about our guest. Crystal Yankawgé Nelson is TNC's Community Development Specialist for Southeast Alaska. She's Tlingit tribal member from the Raven Moiety and the Coho clan and the Humpback Whale House from Dry Bay. She currently lives in Juneau, Alaska. Christine Woll is TNC's Southeast Alaska Program Director. She became passionate about living off the land and water when she first moved to Alaska and learned to fish with her dad. Christine joined TNC to support coastal communities in their own self-sustainability and self-determination, and sees the Seacoast Trust as a culmination of her goals. So as you think of questions for Crystal and Christine, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And after their presentation, we're going to have a great conversation and get to your questions. So thanks again for joining us today, Crystal and Christine, and let's dive in.
Great. Thank you so much, Deb. Yankawgé, Gunilchish Hati Adi Yankawgé, Tlingit Einach, Yankawgé Kagunach, Duji Kla Yuchatuasak, Lit Kaach Einach, Crystal Nelson Yuchatuasak, Tlingit Ayachat, Yeilna Ayachat, Tluknach Shah Nachat City, Yai Hitach, Unachukwan, Ilkuhas Chukanedi Kaach Dakanuk U Wushkitan City, Gunalchish Wushkitan. Santik ihinik yechat yati, Tlingit ani kak. You people of honor and self-respect, thank you all for coming today. My Tlingit names are Yankawgé and Gunach Duji Kla. My English name is Crystal Nelson. I am Tlingit, otherwise said in English as Tlingit. I am from the Raven Moiety, the Coho or Silver Salmon clan, and the Humpback Whale House from Dry Bay, which is just south of Yakutat at the northern tip of Southeast Alaska. I'm the grandchild of the Chukanedi, the Eagle Brown Bear clan from Hoonah, and the Wushkitan, the Eagle Shark clan from the Juneau area. The Wushkitan is my outer shell, my great-grandfather's clan, which I'm going to tell you a little something about here in just a minute. I currently live in Juneau, Alaska, a place called Tsantikahini in my language, which means precious water for the starry flounder. Starry flounders are a small halibut-like fish that used to be abundant in the whole Juneau area. We acknowledge that the people who this area belongs to and who belong to this area are the Akwaan of the Tlingit people. Ak is little lake in Tlingit, so Akwaan means people of the little lake. That lake is about a 15-minute drive north of where I sit and about 5 minutes from where Christine sits. And we also sit at the border of the Taku. The mighty Taku River is about a 15-minute boat ride south of here, depending on the weather and how fast your boat is. The Taku are the people of the river that floods, and in the fall time, a river that is abundant with Canadian geese. We acknowledge that the Taku belong to this place as well. I'm a community development specialist for TNC here in this place, Occoquan, and I've been in this role for 3 years and in conservation 4 years, but I've been in community development for 14 years now. Who I am is rooted in Tlingit cultural norms of contributing to the whole. So that's why I turned early on in my academic and professional career to community development. In these photos, you see my son Jude and I near the top of Mount Roberts here in Juneau. And on the right, this is my little family, my husband and 3 kids. We are all Tlingit, and my husband and kids are also Eyak, and the 2 older kids are Yupik on their mom's side. In my Tlingit culture, leadership is measured by how well you take care of others. In Tlingit economics, we stockpile resources and then redistribute them in a ku'ik, or in English, a potlatch. And in doing so, we made sure that no one went hungry, and our kinship structure made sure that no one was ever homeless. One of the most important concepts we grow up with in my culture is an ideal in which we become a kunach Tlingit, which means a real human being or a true human being. You become a true human being by constantly striving to become better, by strengthening yourself, by always reciprocating what others do for you, and by taking care of others. The people anointed chiefs in my culture were the ones who took care of the most people. These are my great-grandparents on the left, Eva Barry Gamble and Frank Gamble. We are a matrilineal people, and Eva is my mother's mother's mother, so I am of her clan, the Coho clan. My grandmother's father from the Shark clan represents this outer shell that I mentioned in the previous slide. This is a very special relationship in Tlingit culture, as we say that we would not exist without our outer shell. One day, an elder who was raised by Frank Gamble as his own told me that my great-grandfather was a very good man. He was a leader in the time when settlers moved into Alaska, during a time of land grabs and of Jim Crow in Alaska. In a time where signs in store windows read, "No dogs, no natives," Frank Gamble was busy taking care of his people the best way that he knew how. He built houses for Native people for free when you can bet the housing situation was dire. When this elder told me this about my great-grandfather, my outer shell without whom I would not exist, it was as if my destiny had found me. I was just beginning my community development pathway, and walking in his footsteps made me feel powerfully connected to him and to our cultural values. His efforts are the embodiment of a kunach Tlingit, and I found my life's work of helping my people to start meeting our basic human needs again. Because of this, the project that we'll be talking to you about today, the Seacoast Trust, makes me feel like I can truly say that all that I am and everything that I've done has led me here. Thinking of this as a legacy project that will help take care of my people and this place, it makes my heart sing. So any action that you all are inspired to today, Ganachish, thank you. We appreciate it to the core. So with that, I'll offer you the most important word in my language, Ganachish, thank you. Christine will now tell you how she got here to this place and this project.
No, sheesh, Crystal, and thank you all. I'm honored to be here today and honored to be on the lands of the Occoquan and Takuquan. My name is Christine Woll, and I'm the Southeast Alaska Program Director for the Nature Conservancy. And when Crystal says all that I am and all that I've done has led me here, that's my personal truth as well. The pictures on the right are of my grandfather, my father, and me with our trophy-winning striped bass that we caught off the Massachusetts coast, which is where I grew up. I've given this presentation quite a few times, but never to an East Coast audience. So I'm excited to get to show these pictures to folks who recognize how big that fish my grandfather holding truly is. The larger picture is me trolling for salmon just behind my house here in Juneau not too long ago. And the boat you see me in is the same New England style dory that I grew up fishing out of when I was young. I began my passion for living off the land and water, fishing out of this boat with my father. And when I moved to Alaska with my boat tied to the racks of my Subaru, it was because I really wanted a life where I could do just that. I wanted to be able to fish and hunt in my backyard, and I wanted to be able to make my living supporting coastal communities who want to be able to do that too. And so this project is really the culmination of that work for me. So where we live here in Alaska, introductions are really critical to understanding each other. And so I just wanted to pause and thank you all for giving us the opportunity to fully introduce ourselves to you today. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the place that Crystal and I have the privilege of living and practicing conservation, which is Southeast Alaska. If you take a look up at my camera, in Alaska, we use our hand to show people where we live. If my hand is Alaska, Southeast Alaska is the thumb here. When you hear the word rainforest, I bet you are thinking about tropical climates like the Amazon, but this place, Southeast Alaska, is also a rainforest. It's not raining right now, but it's very close to, it's about to rain. And it's known as the Tongass rainforest. And just like the Amazon, this place is giant. It's about 20 million acres, and it's relatively undeveloped. You can see on the map on the right the historic extent of the coastal temperate rainforest in the Pacific Northwest. The red areas that stretch from California to Washington have been almost completely developed, whereas the green portions in British Columbia and Alaska are still relatively intact. We call these green intact places the Emerald Edge. In the Emerald Edge, we get spoiled by the amount of iconic and endemic species we have, often literally in our backyards. So things like grizzly bears and wolves and migratory birds. And of course, my favorite, the mighty Pacific salmon. This place is one of the very few temperate rainforests in the world, and it's been shown to be one of the most climate resilient places in North America. We still have a lot of these ginormous old growth trees, and they store the carbon equivalent of 6 million cars a year while producing a quarter of all the salmon in the Pacific Northwest. So it's pretty easy to see how globally important this climate stronghold is for addressing climate change and in protecting rare species. The history of conservation in this place is pretty dramatic. It's been a never-ending conflict between environmental and business interests over old growth logging in the Tongass National Forest. As the years go by, we see this tennis match of headlines vacillating between the Tongass has been protected and the Tongass is under attack, and back and forth. Photo on the left illustrates this with a kind of typical demonstration in DC about logging. And as you might expect, old growth logging has done tremendous damage to these landscapes and for their potential to fight climate change. The picture on the left is an old growth forest, and the picture on the right is a forest growing back after it's been clear cut. The place on the right provides diminished habitat because no light reaches the forest floor and the trees just don't store as much carbon as the big trees on the left. But what a lot of people don't know about the Tongass is that it's not actually global demand for wood products or population rise and development that's threatening these forests. It's actually the conflict itself. We've all been so busy fighting each other over and over again about old growth that we haven't had the time, resources, or attention to create forest protection in this place that actually lasts, or to restore these landscapes that badly need healing.
The land isn't the only thing that needs healing. All during this conflict, the true owners of this place have been and continue to be ignored, or worse, vilified. These are the people indigenous to this place. Alaska is truly a native place. We have an impressive 40% of the nation's federally recognized tribes, or 229 out of the 574 in the US. In a country where Native people are usually less than 1% of a state's population, we're almost 20% here. Alaska is such a big place that we have many diverse bioregions spanning from the Arctic tundra at the top down through the coastal temperate rainforest at the bottom, where Christine and I live and work. The map on the left shows these major bioregions, while the map on the right shows the 20 different indigenous languages in Alaska. The blues in the language map represent the Inuit languages, while the reds and purples are the different Athabaskan languages, or the Dene language family, which my language is actually a member of. What I love about these two maps side by side is that you can see these broad strokes of language families. They actually mirror the bioregions. In the boreal forest, where all the Athabaskan languages are, the languages and cultures will look very similar to each other, but they'll be very different from those in, let's say, the Inuit bioregions. So the land literally shapes the fundamental and distinct elements of our culture. And in this way, we are the land. We've been connected to these homelands for tens of thousands of years. My people have creation stories taking place right here in Southeast Alaska. We have stories dating back to the ice ages of moving inland during the Great Flood and then returning to the coast when it was safe again. From this perspective, 150 years of settler law just doesn't really compare. This should be honored no matter whose name is on a property deed. This is a native land and forever a native place. Because of colonization, Alaska Natives have so little sovereignty over our lands. The process used to dispossess us of our title was full of trauma. For example, the boarding of residential schools with missionaries who committed horrible acts of violence toward Native children. The photo on the left is the infamous Carlisle Indian School, which served as the model for residential schools and missionary homes across this continent. This was not so long ago. My grandmother was raised in missionary homes after she lost both of her parents as a child. This is my grandmother and her brother in the photo on the right. With this dispossession and assimilation, we experienced an immense destabilization in our social structures, our ability to take care of ourselves, each other, and this place. The aftermath sets the scene in which we do our conservation work today, because when we go into Indigenous communities still reeling from colonization, we need to allow for a more holistic approach to conservation. It wasn't until 1970 that settler governments finally attempted to settle our claims to land. An act of Congress created over 200 for-profit Native corporations, gave us a tiny fraction of our lands back, a little bit of money, and they said, go and take care of your people with for-profit companies. This was a white-led social experiment, really compelled by the need to expedite the state's claim to land so that they could extract billions of barrels of oil from Alaska's North Shore. While there were a few reservations in Alaska at the time, all but one were extinguished in favor of this corporate model. The Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act also extinguished our hunting and fishing rights. You can see in the map on the left the tiny fraction of lands we got back in the form of corporate lands that tribes in Alaska have no jurisdiction over. You can see that in our region here in Southeast, Native people got the least land back. Clearly, the situation is complicated when you have over 200 tribes and now over 200 corporations, and the corporations get all the land and money, even though the tribes are the sovereign governments. The impact is that tribes now have greatly diminished sovereignty in Alaska, and Native corporations are constantly pitted against tribes. Still, over the last 50 years, we've tried to fulfill this corporate socioeconomic mission. But when Congress told us to go and take care of your people with for-profit companies in a state with a highly extractive economy in the 1970s when timber was king, what do suddenly corporate Native communities do? We get right into extractivism and try to survive. Since the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act was a social experiment, we end up litigating against each other and litigating against the government constantly as well. And all the while we're fighting each other, we now find ourselves as villains in the timber conflict and enemies of conservation interests. The conservationists, especially those who don't live here or understand the how and why we got into extractivism, they also litigate against Native corporations, oppose further Indigenous claims to land, and participate in actions that really only further the divisions in our communities. Sealaska Native Corporation, a corporation that I am a proud shareholder of, was once the biggest villain in the Tongass story. As the regional corporation, they have the largest share of private land in Southeast Alaska and have been a major player in the timber industry here. So much of the opposition to logging has been targeted towards Sealaska.
10 years ago, the story that we've been telling was the dominant story on the Tongass. Most conservation groups and industry groups were fighting over old growth logging, and those groups were also ignoring or vilifying the voices of the people whose lands these really were. TNC was in this mix, but we were realizing that the fight over old growth was not working to meet our conservation goals. And in fact, these battles that we were engaging in were actually making things worse. And so we and a few other organizations decided to try something different. We started partnering with the communities on the Tongass on what they actually wanted and needed in this place: healthy fish and wildlife, food security, renewable energy, sustainable jobs. We built a partnership at what we call the speed of trust of those who had historically not gotten along: conservation groups, tribes, Native corporations, so that we could invest time and resources in mutually agreed upon priorities in a way that gave deference to these Indigenous communities and began to transition the economy from one that was rooted in extractivism and logging to an economy that brought equitable, sustainable wealth across the region. This partnership was called the Sustainable Southeast Partnership. Now, this partnership has been doing things for a decade that a decade ago we never thought was possible. We built a strong network of people that work together to support community priorities and the social capital to do big things.
We are doing meaningful work on the ground, supporting tribes in managing and monitoring their lands and waters.
We're innovating, developing regenerative local economies in things like fisheries and cultural tourism.
We are decolonizing and indigenizing, learning how to do conservation that does not harm Indigenous communities and how to incorporate Indigenous voices and ways of knowing into our practices.
And we're collaborating with each other, organizations once on different sides of a conflict, working together to make actual durable conservation progress. And with this success and momentum, we think now is the time to solidify this model for future generations in Southeast Alaska. The Nature Conservancy has been working with the largest regional Alaska Native corporation, Sealaska, the largest regional tribe, Central Council Tlingit and Haida Indian Tribes of Alaska, as well as a variety of local tribes and community development organizations to co-create a permanent funding mechanism to continue and expand this work we're doing together. We're calling this effort the Seacoast Trust, and we're proud to be something that is truly community-led. These organizations on this list here working together on something big like this, I cannot underscore for you what a sea change that represents for this place.
The Seacoast Trust, once established, will provide annual funding support to Alaska Native communities in achieving their goals for community well-being and conservation. The Trust will support Indigenous stewardship activities, which will give communities greater decision-making authority over how the forests on both Alaska Native Corporation lands and Tongass National Forest lands are managed and conserved. We expect that with the establishment of the Seacoast Trust, the participatory land use visioning and mapping that we've been piloting through the Sustainable Southeast Partnership will expand into new communities and cover the region. And we are especially excited about the development of Indigenous Guardians programming in Southeast Alaska, modeled after Canada's Indigenous Guardians, which you may or may not have heard a little something about. Our partners have secured a historic agreement with the Forest Service to create these Guardians programs in the next 3 years.
The Trust will also support sustainable economic development initiatives in the region. By investing in local prosperity and entrepreneurship, the Trust will ensure that communities will use this decision-making authority on the Tongass to choose sustainability and conservation over extractivism and logging.
And finally, the Trust will invest in projects that increase racial equity and community healing by addressing the divides in our region between industry and environmentalists, between Alaska Native tribes and Alaska Native corporations, between Native and non-Native community members. We will increase the social capital that's vital to getting these projects done and ensuring the voices in the region are finally unified in what is best for these communities and these lands. And indeed, it was the group of people who defined these goals together.
We really think what's unique about this project is that the outcomes of this work will not be predetermined. They will be defined collectively with Indigenous communities' voices at the center. But we still want to emphasize that we're expecting the outcomes of this work to be big. Over the next 10 years, we anticipate as many as 1.5 million acres of rainforest to come more directly under community and tribal authority as these communities grow their Guardians programs and their community land use planning. These lands are about 50% old growth forest and 15% historically logged and in need of restoration and improved management. In a place where an acre of forest can store an average of 100 metric tons of carbon a year, putting communities at the lead of managing these lands will have globally significant climate mitigation impacts. We expect to create at least 300 new jobs and other economic benefits by spurring new carbon projects on Alaska Native Corporation lands, creating career paths for communities on the lands and in the woods, and growing new small businesses in tourism, fisheries, and mariculture. This represents more jobs than the timber industry provides to these rural communities. And finally, the Trust will invest in strengthening relationships and social capital. Greatest barrier towards durable conservation on the Tongass being the conflict itself. This means that without healing, none of these other outcomes are possible.
The Alaska Native Corporation, the largest Native landowner in the region, and the company once thought of as being on the other side of the aisle from us in the fight over old growth. In the last few years, they've become quite a different company. They've made our ancestral Indigenous values into their core business values and began dramatically revamping their business portfolio. Over the last 2 years, they have made two big announcements. First, that they have protected a third of their lands, about 175,000 acres, in a massive carbon project. And secondly, they hope to completely phase out of old growth timber harvest, which would represent a significant shift for the whole of the regional timber industry. But Sealaska is not interested in phasing out of old growth logging unless it comes with a careful and just transition, one that ensures that Native communities that they represent have equitable access to sustainable jobs moving forward, which is why they recently made another big decision. They want to invest a sizable portion of their carbon project revenue into the Seacoast Trust because they believe this project will secure this common goal that we have for the future of these lands and its people. But this is contingent on conservationists stepping up as well to solidify this new paradigm shift. Sealaska has come to TNC and asked us to join them in raising funds for the trust. In this first phase, our target goal is to establish a fund at 20 million. In the past year and a half, TNC with Sealaska has been able to secure 17 million in pledges from this first couple of donors. And so if we can raise another 3 million, we will establish the Seacoast Trust, which we then plan to take into a public fundraising phase, and will hopefully eventually go well beyond doubling our initial $20 million amount. As we build the Seacoast Trust, we have the chance to powerfully mark the turn to a new and critical chapter in this story once marred by conflict and destruction. The significance of this work doesn't stop there. We think the impacts will reach beyond the 20 million acres of the Tongass. We spoke earlier of how conservationists for too long have vilified Indigenous peoples for doing what we needed to do to survive. In other places around the world, places like the Great Bear Rainforest in Canada, conservationists have been successful at setting up permanent financing for conservation that actually works to increase the rights of Indigenous peoples. But when it comes to equitable conservation, we think it's time to do even better. The truth is that most of these permanent financing models for conservation around the world have been driven by conservationists, with the benefits coming to communities only once a certain number of acres have been protected or other requirements have been met. We think that this project is different. The Seacoast Trust is a conservation solution co-created with the Indigenous leaders of this place, and one that puts trust in the people to define outcomes along the way. For example, if we create additional protected areas, we will do so on Indigenous terms. We think it's compelling that our partners are driving this project, and this may be the first time that Indigenous people have initiated and taken ownership of conservation financing in this way. We hope that this project can put forward to the world a new, more equitable, decolonized model of doing conservation, a model that moves from power over to power with, power to, and finally, power within. Conservationists are always looking for permanence. Well, in this place, the permanence is the Indigenous people. We have been here since time immemorial and plan on being connected to our homelands forever. In the 14 years I've worked in community development, this has been one of my most important projects. The other two have to do with language revitalization and renewable energy for my people. All have equal space in my heart. This project will set us on a path of restoring the land and its peoples and give each of us, including conservationists, an opportunity to become a Tlingit, a true human being. I love ending on this slide. This phrase you see here in Tlingit is our profound wish. It comes from a powerful chant written by a leader and language activist in our state, Kune Lance Twitchell. Meaning emphatically, it will be so forever. To all of you for being here, for listening to our stories, and for helping to make this so. Thank you.
Wow, I just want to thank you both, and especially Crystal, your stories of your heritage and how you got to this place, and the history of colonization and what that's really meant for the Native people of Alaska is really eye-opening. And I can imagine the folks who have been listening to this webinar are moved and inspired. And Christine, the partnership that you're bringing in the history is really just incredible. I was impressed with just how innovative this whole approach is, and is transformative. And whether or not when we look back, it becomes a model for how conservationists engage in the world, not just Alaska. So first, thank you so much for your presentation. Just incredible. I guess I've got to, first let me remind folks, our audience, to put any questions you have for Crystal and Christine into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And because I'm looking for your thoughts, your questions, so we can have a real conversation. And I want to begin with Crystal. You know, as a Tlingit tribal member, how does your heritage inform your values about the land and how you approach conservation?
Yeah, this is such a big question. There's so much that goes into it. I mean, you see in my my story that, you know, it's really my cultural values have informed every decision that I've made about my career. You know, I come from a very collectivist culture, and you know, in which we're expected to contribute to the whole. And yeah, so that's why I ended up at TNC. And you know, I think what's interesting or important about our presentation is that we're sort of challenging people to think of conservation in a different way. And as someone who's, you know, studied my language, has spent time with elders, you know, one of the most important lessons that I learned in my language from my favorite elder who passed away last year, one of the most profound things he taught me was Sikat at Yankawgé kudziti, we askwani Yankawgé kudziti, hin Yankawgé kudziti, kusachan Yankawgé kudziti. He said, everything has a spirit. The people of the trees have a spirit. Water has a spirit. Even love has a spirit. And so, you know, what this teaches me and it teaches everyone is that when things have a spirit, you don't own something. You know, you have to be in relationship with whatever being that is. And, you know, we definitely consider human beings as part of the environment. And, you know, it's the separation of economics from the social and the environmental is what got us into this mess in the first place around the world. And so I often say that it's going to take the integration of those things to heal the planet, to heal the people, heal our economy. And so we can't, you know, as conservationists, come with just the approach of environment only. And maybe some places around the world that are, you know, in really bad shape, maybe it will take, you know, sort of blocking off and having this fortress protection approach. But, you know, in this place with the history and where people are at now and what it actually takes to get things done and change the system in this place, it takes that integration and that holistic approach.
Yeah, there was a comment in the chat, and let me encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A box, but because I'll see those more readily. But I thought the comment, it's from Turzatipin Po, and she notes that this model of co-creation seems very rooted in our indigenous way of being. As leaders in sustainability for thousands of years, it must be gratifying to see the model adopted by those from outside. And I wonder, you know, what you think about that, this idea, because I think that is part of what's radically different about the model, is that it's in some ways thinking about co-creation, thinking about the future, and not having it be the model that comes from, you know, colonization, where the outside comes in and imposes different values.
Yeah, I also often say that, you know, a lot of indigenous worldviews, you know, like I was saying, we don't separate humans from the environment and, you know, economics. We also don't separate the head from the heart and the hands and the spirit. You know, we approach these all at once. And I think people at TNC are getting used to that style that I bring and, you know, expect of us in our meetings. You know, we get to know each other. It's built on relationship first. Relationship is extremely important in Indigenous communities. And I also, you know, I come from a background in community development academically, and from one that's really rooted in community-based participatory research. to where everything that we do is co-created from the beginning to the end. And I think it's a really important approach because I also often say at TNC, we have a lot of power. We're a global organization. Yeah. We have all these connection to resources. We often, raise a lot of money rooted in our stories with work with Indigenous people and make the determination on how that reaches the ground. And so that's a big power differential when it comes to marginalized communities or communities that are still in social and economic distress from colonization. And so I always say that we really need to work to balance that power differential. And the best way to do that is to be as participatory as possible, from just the inkling of an idea of a program to do that rooted in relationship and community, to the implementation and ownership, the benefit of it. And then even in the evaluation, what's important to the communities that they want to know about the work. And so, yeah.
So I know as an organization, we're really grappling and thinking deeply about privilege. Like we have so much privilege as, this powerful organization and as individuals who are educated and affluent and have so many advantages. So how do we use our privilege to help lift others and to be of service to others' objectives rather than coming in with our own. So I think this is a really, really inspiring model. I'm wondering, Crystal, thinking about community development, right? And, you both have these rich backgrounds in community development. As someone coming in to do this work, I'd love to know a little bit more about our community development work in the region.
Mm-hmm. I'd love Christine to help me out with this question because there's so much that we've done. We talked about the Sustainable Southeast Partnership. We talked about how long this has been. It's been over a decade now where people came together, conservationists, Native people, people that represent all the different, important entities in this region. And realizing that just the advocacy approach or just this, protect approach was only fueling the conflict. And it, in the meantime, we weren't actually getting the protection, because the Forest Service is so influential and, there's politics and people's livelihoods at stake. And so, we've invested in community forest partnerships with rural Indigenous communities in 2 villages have really strong community forest partnerships that have, brought all of the community members, the stakeholders, the rights holders, community members in for input about, the lands around their village and how they use the lands, because it's very important to Indigenous people is that we live off the lands and waters and need to have a say. We've invested heavily in sustainable entrepreneurship, and we set up I think it was over $1 million in a revolving loan fund that helped finance new emerging sustainable economic development, new businesses that have great impacts in the communities. That multiplier effect that happens when you have local businesses. What am I missing, Christine?
I was just going to add that I think people who haven't been here to Southeast Alaska, one of the things they don't realize is that, we lack a lot of kind of quote unquote modern infrastructure. There are no roads that connect our communities. Even here in Juneau, the capital of Alaska, I can't drive to Juneau. I have to fly or take a boat to leave. And so that makes it hard, for big industries to show up and create a lot of jobs. But what we do have in these communities is a lot of ingenuity and innovation and drive to build businesses that are supportive of that really go a long way to helping the community and providing things the community needs and opening up their communities in some cases to visitors and people who want to visit Alaska. And so that's why kind of a focus on entrepreneurship has been so important, as it's allowed the communities to kind of self-determine these are the activities we want to be doing in these as opposed to, having some sort of boom and bust industry like we saw in the timber industry of the past.
So I was wondering also, Christine, from your perspective, why are our Indigenous partnerships in the Emerald Edge so important?
I think it's pretty simple, really. The people who were here before us, they were here, for 10,000 years, and they took care of the environment in a way that no one has been able to match since. We've messed things up pretty bad since white people showed up in Southeast Alaska. And so in order to think about restoring and healing those mistakes of the past, there's no way to do that without leaning on the knowledge and that long history to do that conservation work.
Yeah, that makes sense. We've got a question from Dan Sarles. He's a member of our Board of Trustees in Massachusetts. And he asked a question that I was wondering as well. Did Sealaska's change of approach come from a new younger leadership or a change in point of view from existing leadership? How did this change happen? Like, is it a generational shift in approach?
I think so. It's a very political question. And I do have family at Sealaska who work there and who are influential there. But yes, I think it was some of the newer, younger board members who came on, and they really, it was a long process, that good old saying, it takes a long time to turn a big ship. But I actually think maybe about 10 years ago was really an inflection point, because they set up a committee, and I volunteered as a young shareholder to go to that committee, but it was really about redoing their whole strategic plan and their core values. And so I was actually there when they started to explore, what are Indigenous values, and how do we make that into business values and make that work. And so what you saw after that was, sort of slowly shifting their operations. We used to manufacture plastic in a remote part of the world. And so they pulled out of those businesses, they moved the businesses closer to home. They're now investing in things like ocean health. I mean, it's really a phenomenal turnaround. And it was thankfully due to some of the younger board members, and then slowly along the way adding new board members who shared that same vision. And yeah, now it's just an amazing company. And like I said, I'm proud of Sealaska for the changes that they've made and how they want to invest in this region, especially through Seacoast Trust. That's really exciting.
Really impressive. Wendell Cern wonders, are you pursuing renewable energy projects such as wind, tidal, and hydro?
We in the region definitely are, and this is definitely near and dear to my heart. I'm still slowly finishing up my master's in rural development, and my project is focused on getting our communities to 100% renewable energy. And of course, given this amazing landscape where the water meets the mountain like this, our biggest resource for renewable energy is the high elevation lakes and the rivers. And so small hydro is what we're looking at. I like to call it fiscally responsible hydro. I don't know if I've made that up, if I read that somewhere, but that's
I'll credit you with it. I like that.
That's what we're pursuing, and I'm exploring how to do that work as community development work in my role as community development specialist for the Nature Conservancy. And I think it is one of the most important things that we can do beyond this project here that we're talking about, because the electric rates in native villages are just astronomical, like 60 cents a kilowatt hour. And wow. People dropping out of college because they can't afford it, because they have to pay $1,000 a month for their electric bill. I mean, this is because of the diesel generated power that we have in our communities. And Native communities are the last ones to get renewable energy. Juneau's on big hydro, and Native communities are, it's definitely one of those enabling conditions. Any good community development work that we'll do in communities will be hampered by the extreme cost of energy. So that's definitely an important focus of Sustainable Southeast Partnership, and now in my role with TNC.
That's great. A lot of good opportunity there, it sounds like. We have a comment from Constantine Pohl, who says, thank you so much for this thorough presentation of the systems thinking, state-of-the-art, all-embracing project. It is very motivating to hear about this powerful big story actually taking place in the ecological restoration. I would agree. I couldn't have said it better myself. Janet Weber asks, she says, I'm familiar with the role of guardians in Yankawgé. Can you
Yankawgé.
Thank you. Say that again, please.
Yankawgé.
Yankawgé. Thank you. Can you talk a little more about how this model can be used or adapted in your project? That could be for either of you.
Definitely. We have always loved the Guardians model. It's actually not a new thing. Indigenous people on the Pacific Northwest coast have had what we call guardians or watchmen roles, as part of our culture for many thousands of years. And so this is really a revitalization of that role, but in today's context and what that means for us politically, and to be able to reclaim sovereignty and express that sovereignty, even if it is not acknowledged in the state of Alaska as it should be yet. And so, there have been a group of people within the Sustainable Southeast Partnership who have been, working to make Guardians a reality and supported in ways similar to how it's supported in Canada for a while now. And that really kicked off when we got a bunch of our, key community members and leaders and doers to Canada to visit with folks who do Guardians programming, and really took that inspiration. And we have the right building blocks. They'll look different than they are in Canada, but we have the right people, the right time, the right building blocks to create Guardians programs in this region. And we'll adapt it to our unique context in Southeast Alaska, but it's already generating a lot of excitement and curiosity, I think. So stay tuned. We definitely hope that this endowment will help fund the operations, the annual operations and special projects, just as it does with our neighbors and relatives just over these mountains here in Canada.
That's great. Well, there's a question that maybe we could ask Christine. One of the attendees said Alaska is a unique situation because of the demographics you spoke about, 20% Indigenous people and far more recognized tribes than any other areas. How do you suppose this model could be adopted outside of this area, especially with many places along the East Coast that are far more densely populated and less represented with indigenous communities? Is there something we could learn from and replicate? I think it's an interesting question.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and the reality is, we often learn in our history that Indigenous peoples aren't here anymore, and they are still here, and there is so much kind of healing and revitalization happening in every part of the country. And so I mentioned I'm from Massachusetts. I'm from Pembroke, and I was I'm sure some of you know more than I do, but just reading about the Wampanoag in that language revitalization that's happening now, 300 years after the language hadn't been spoken for many of years. And so I bring that up just because I think, it's not too late for conservation organizations to begin to build relationships with those communities. you can begin with something very small. You know, we as the Nature Conservancy did not have relationships until we, you know, started showing up and asking these communities what they needed and listening and learning. And I think that can be done in any part of the country or the world as a beginning step to building those relationships that can turn into much larger projects.
So it's this service model that you're really demonstrating. I want to make sure that we give people, we've got a question that I'm sure other people are thinking about is, what are some of the ways that individuals can support your work? And, you know, we're heading to the end. Liz Alverson put in the chat some specific contact information to support Emerald Edge, and then a link to the Bristol Bay recording. But is there any final message that you want to give to folks?
Well, I'll start first and then I'll tell Crystal. First, before I answer that question, I just wanted to give out a shout out. My AP environmental science teacher is in the audience. Wendell, thank you so much, Wendell, for helping me get on this path that I'm on now. And great to see you there. Yeah, we're as we mentioned, we are in a, you know, we're in a fundraising phase to make this trust reality, and so you know, happy to talk more about that if anyone's interested in supporting the work. But in general, you know, we want this story shared. We think it is, as we said, a model for how conservation can be done other places, and we love telling the story that we just told. And so if you know others who would benefit from hearing it, we love giving this presentation. So yeah, it sounds like someone put some contact info in the chat. So feel free to reach out. We'd love to chat more.
Well, we are heading to the end of our time, and I just want to thank both of you again. Really inspiring. We had a couple of late breaking questions about how we could apply this kind of work to in North America, thinking about what political changes would need to be in play for this model to really be applicable, and whether or not we've got relationships with Indigenous groups in Rhode Island and Massachusetts. And we don't really have time to dig into that. The truth is we have a lot of work still to do, but to have a model to refer to and to see how you've done it is really a first step, a good first step for those of us who are just starting to think about, you know, what, you know, how to have and build these kinds of relationships with the Indigenous communities in our own areas. So I hope this is the beginning of a bigger story. So I just want to thank you again for joining us today. I want to thank everyone also who's tuned in for your support of the Nature Conservancy. It's your support that makes all of this work possible. We're going to be sending a follow-up email to all of you. You'll get it over the coming days, and it'll have links to the resources we talked about today, a recording of this webinar. If you're enjoying this webinar, or if you know anyone else you think might be interested in getting this information, feel free to forward it, and feel free to have them add their names to our list so they get invited to future webinars. You can follow us on social media at conserve_MA on Facebook and Instagram to keep up with our work and to get updates on upcoming virtual opportunities to connect with us. And as always, you can see our upcoming webinars and sign up at nature.org/MA webinars. We'll be taking a break from webinars for the rest of August, but we're working on an exciting lineup for the fall, so stay tuned. And I just want to thank you, Christine and Crystal, again for joining us. You were just amazing.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for having us. We just really appreciate it. Like Christine said, we love sharing the story. This work is so important to us. And I wish I could see everyone's faces, but we're just really grateful to be able to be here and be with you all and tell the story. So thank you.
Have a wonderful afternoon all. Thank you.